Season 2 is an interesting season to talk about. I've got a few points to cover here. We'll go ahead and go over them in no particular order. I like to call Season 2 the grab bag of Voyager because, well, because it was. And I'll go ahead and explain a little bit of why as I go over this, but I'm probably going to reference that grab bag comment a bit, so bear with me if you will. Voyager... Okay. Under the hood, Voyager used and reused a lot of episodes that were already pitched, either for Season 1 or for TNG or for DS9 in some cases, and had those episodes just kind of reworked in order to make it work for Voyager, which is fine. I'm not necessarily saying anything against that. But that came out most strongly in Season 2. A huge amount of these episodes were episodes that were just thrown together with no plot or coherence. There was no central theme. There was no central story arc other than the Jonas thing, in which in some cases was actually kind of ham-fistedly shoved in. Threshold is a good example of that. The point is, they never actually tried to do anything with Season 2 other than to make it another season of episodes. Forgive me for sounding elitist, I guess, or whatever, but I feel like Star Trek is usually at its best when it tries to do something. Deep Space Nine was actually a really good example of that. Voyager Season 3, well, actually, excuse me, Season 4 was actually a really good example of that. Season 3 was good, but we'll get to that later. TNG Season 3, another good example of that. There are a lot of instances where they tried to do something with Trek, and they tended to succeed when they actually made some kind of theme or arc or over. It doesn't have to necessarily be a coherent, continuity thing. It can just be the same general type of theme, like I said in the case of TNG. Or it can be setting continuity, like in the case of Deep Space Nine. Or it can be string continuity. Enterprise even did that with Season 3. But Season 2 of Voyager was just random episodes flung into the bag and just kind of shook around. You could watch Season 2 with the exception of the Michael Jonas arc, well, debatably. With the exception of the last episode of the Michael Jonas arc, okay, let me explain this differently. With the exception of Basics Part 1, which, has to be at the end, and the last episode, Investigations of the Michael Jonas arc, all the rest could be shoved basically wherever, as long as the previous Michael Jonas episodes were before this one, if you understand what I mean by that. You could literally slot all those in here randomly, and all the other episodes could be all over the place. No difference at all. No change in anything. And I felt like that was kind of a weakness for the season, personally. It is also worth noting that Season 2 contains 3 of my least favorite episodes of all time in Voyager, and that includes Alliances, Innocence, and Threshold, which I've talked enough about, I think. Now, by the same token, I mentioned that grab bag thing, and I'm going to mention it again because Season 2 also contains some of my favorite Voyager episodes, including Thaw, Tuvix, and, I suddenly can't think of the name of it, Death Wish, and Meld, for God's sakes. All of those episodes were in Season 2. And that's kind of one of the reasons why Voyager got to keep going. Now, before we talk about that whole thing, I want to talk about the under-the-hood changes. Towards the end of Season 2... let's just say that the existing people who were primarily in charge of Voyager really wanted to keep going in the same direction they had been, and whether that's a positive or a negative is going to depend on your opinion, basically. But they really wanted to keep going with the Kazon arc, they really wanted to keep going with the Seska arc, and they really wanted to push for Suitor to be a little bit more of a recurring character. And they really wanted to just kind of keep the same general grab bag feel. Well, that wasn't actually very well received, and there was a bit of a changing of the guard. Some people actually ended up resigning, or later, I shouldn't say resigning, but it's more like they took more of a backseat position rather than being in the driver's seat. That's probably a better way to put it. In other words, a lot of the guard was changed at the end of Season 2, and Basics was actually pretty much completely overhauled, both as a result of this and after this, or rather, causing this and then as a result of this, because Basics was originally going to undertake a completely different feel. Originally, Basics was going to lead into the big Seska Kazon arc, and Suitor was going to become a major secondary character, possibly even a B-list cast member. And they were going to go ahead and move further and further in the direction of exploring this whole Chakotay's child thing. Well, if you're paying attention, basically the exact opposite of that happened. That's why I say that was originally basics, and then they changed a lot of it, basically completely inverted it, and that's when a lot of the old guard said, "Okay, fine, do whatever." And some people switched around, some people changed positions, some people were brought in new, and some people left. And then we got the basics that we have now, which is basically after the fact designed to wipe the board clean and basically start Voyager over. In other words, you can actually look at I forget the name of the episode, but the one after Basics Part 2. In other words, Season 3 as the actual beginning of Voyager for all intents and purposes, because it kind of was in several ways. Which is funny if you think about it, because that's kind of a trend with Star Trek, isn't it? Let's see, original series probably didn't really have that, except for the fact that it kind of did in Season 3. Season 3 is when Roddenberry really took more of a backseat to the show and let other people handle the property. Whether that is a good or a bad thing is going to depend on opinion. But there was quite a bit of an upset and changing of the guard under the hood in Season 3. Star Trek The Next Generation actually had two major changes. One was pretty much immediately after Season 1, in which Roddenberry was, as has been so often said, kicked upstairs, so he had much less control over everything. That sounds familiar. And they tried to start actually doing a few things with the show, but then in Season 3, they basically did a complete overhaul, virtually an entirely new setup, under the hood, behind the scenes, behind the camera, and tried to, again, basically start Star Trek Next Generation over with Season 3, which is starting to sound a little familiar. But then we look at Deep Space Nine, which actually did that twice, technically, again. And I could keep going, because Enterprise also did that twice. Once leading into the Season 3 with the Xindi thing, and once leading into Season 4 with the Let's Actually Make Our Show About Something season, and start tying it into the continuity of the overall Star Trek mythos. Yeah, this kind of thing happens pretty often, if you're noticing. And it's always happened in every Star Trek, to some extent or another. Now, it is commonly considered that all of these changes were good. Season 3 of Voyager onward is generally the good stuff, as most people say. Season, I don't remember the number, forgive me, but, it's basically when the Dominion started becoming a thing. It started with Way of the Warrior. I know the episode name, where the Klingons, spoiler alert, decided to be Klingons. So that was, everything after that was considered to be pretty good in Deep Space Nine. Season 3 of Onwards in TNG is what most people remember of TNG. Hell, most of the episodes most people remember in TNG in general happen to be in Season 3, in my experience, etc., etc. So it's not really a bad thing. It's just funny that it keeps happening that way, because it's never planned that way. It's always like some people show up and say, let's make a Star Trek. Okay, it's not really working. Okay, let's get people in here with talent and we'll fix it. I'm being facetious, and I'm being unnecessarily unkind. The truth is, in my opinion, this keeps happening because of the fact that there's a difference between a good idea and the execution of a good idea. Voyager was a good idea, a great idea, in fact. But I feel like the people who had that idea could not execute it properly. So they had to bring in new people who had a little more hit or miss. Deep Space Nine, great idea. But they didn't quite know what they were going to do with executing it. And so they shaked things up and brought in a few new people, and, blah, 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 blah. Same thing with TNG, same thing with Enterprise. Decent ideas have to be executed properly. There's a difference between something that's good on paper and something that's good on the screen. But that brings me to my final point, which is how lucky we are. Those of you who are fans of science fiction know that science fiction tends to... I'm going to say not be very popular, but I mean that in the corporate sense, if you know what I mean. In other words, people who are in charge of things that actually, people who are actually in charge of pulling the plug or giving the green light, respectively, tend to not really think kindly of science fiction because they have to be justified more than another show would be in order to keep it on the air. And this tends to happen kind of frequently. And before anybody starts pointing out Firefly or whatnot, this has been going on since forever. In fact, a lot of my viewers, I'm sure, are aware of one of the earliest examples of this, Doctor Who. Old Who, old Who constantly faced issues and problems with this matter, even in the frickin' BBC, which at the time was kind of trying to make a British culture thing after, incidents that we won't go into. So it's just kind of this weird thing that I've noticed. And The only reason Star Trek tended to get as lucky as it did was because of Next Generation and because of Star Trek 4, both of which were incredibly popular and publicly successful. Many people would say that Deep Space Nine is overall a superior show to Next Generation. I'm not going to give any comment on that. I only mention that to say that most of those people are science fiction fans. Yet, in an actual, a corporate, a network, whatever you want to call it, perspective, TNG was by far the more successful of the two. You see where I'm going with this? So even though Deep Space Nine was a phenomenal show, even Deep Space Nine was actually under fairly constant threat of canceling for a fair period of time there. In fact, if it wasn't for the success of First Contact, it probably would have been under a much worse threat of canceling at the time. Now, TNG was almost never under threat of canceling. It was one of the only shows that they actually had the possibility of greenlighting an 8th season, and they decided not to. They actually, which was a good move in my opinion, I might add. But TNG was very successful in that right, and thanks to TNG and Star Trek 4, like I mentioned, and to an extent Star Trek 6 as well, both of which were phenomenally successful from their perspective and ours. Thanks to those things, Star Trek became a brand that actually had worth to people who weren't us, if you understand what I mean by that. And that's why Voyager got lucky, because Voyager got 7 seasons. If it didn't have Star Trek in the name, I guarantee you it would not have had 7 seasons. In fact, I would doubt it would have had 3. It might have had 2. We got very lucky, but it's actually ironic because the same thing turned around. I'm going to go ahead and illustrate how lucky we were, and then I'll talk about it a bit more in a moment by mentioning Enterprise again, the show Enterprise. For those of you not aware, Enterprise was canceled at the termination of its 4th season. For various reasons, but basically the Star Trek franchise was considered damaged by the people who make those decisions, and a movie called Nemesis, which I spit upon. Based on a lot of concepts, they basically just kind of decided to go ahead and put the Star Trek franchise on ice. Now you may be like, oh, thank God. Except if you're actually paying attention, and I'm sure some of you out there who are, Trekkies or Trekkers know about this, Enterprise started getting good towards the end. And I'm not just talking about from our perspective, because a lot of fans started to like Season 3 and especially Season 4, or especially Season 3 and kind of Season 4, depending on your opinion. But otherwise, most people agreed that Enterprise was starting to get good, and it started getting successful from the corporate perspective. Their viewer ratings and their overall Nielsen share and all that done stuff actually went up in Season 4, and actually started having a great deal of increase in the share base. And yet they still put it on ice. Despite the fact that it had Star Trek in the name, despite the fact that it was actually succeeding, they decided, nope. And it was terminated. Now, whether they made the right call or not is not something I can say. I can say my opinion, which is I say they made the absolutely wrong call, but whatever. The point is, even though Enterprise was in a position to actually start succeeding, even from their perspective, they still went ahead and terminated it. That's why I say we are so lucky to have what we have, both with Deep Space Nine and with Voyager, because both of those shows could have had the exact same thing to them happen. Season 2 was a grab bag. There was enough there to piss off a lot of people. Tattoo, Threshold. There was enough there to show that they had potential that they weren't using, like the 37s, or, I don't know, I'm sure, Investigations, that's another good one. And there was enough there that people actually genuinely liked to watch, like Meld and The Thaw. So, based on all those figures, that's basically kind of just barely a net positive in the corporate view, and that's nowhere near enough to justify the continuation of a show, especially a show that had such a lackluster response to Season 1 as well. So, based on all this, it's pretty clear the only reason Voyager kept going was because it had Star Trek in the name, and that still meant something at the time. I say we're lucky because, while some of you may disagree with me by this, I consider myself very fortunate that we managed to get the rest of Voyager that we did. Because I like Voyager. I enjoy watching Voyager. There are episodes I don't like, of course there are. There's episodes in everything that I don't like. But so much of the good in Voyager came from Season 3 and onward, and so many of the episodes that I enjoy watching, or I enjoy analyzing, and I enjoy getting ideas from, all came from season 3 and onward. And while I've heard some mixed opinions about this, most people tend to agree that as soon as the Borg became a lot more prominent within Voyager, you know, for obvious reasons, that the general quality of the show went up. And there are some dips in that, of course. But we wouldn't have gotten that if not for basically sheer, blind, stupid, dumb, doodah, clueless luck. And that's my final commentary on this, basically, is that we know exactly what it's like to not get lucky. We didn't get more of Firefly. We got a movie, which was great, but we didn't get more of the show. We didn't get more of Space Above and Beyond. We didn't get more of... Or was it Earth Above and Beyond? Yeah, whatever. You know the show I'm talking about. We didn't get more of... I suddenly can't think of the name of the episode. There's several. We didn't get more Babylon 5. Let's just go with that one, too, while we're on the subject. We didn't get more of Enterprise. We got lucky with Voyager. And so, I don't know about you guys, but I'm actually really looking forward to continuing going through this show that I like to watch and sharing it with you. And I swear I will try to be less virulent in my opinion about the bad episodes, because there's at least one more episode that really makes me tear my hair out. Actually, there's two. And, yeah, I'm actually not looking forward to watching that much. But other than that, I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you'll share it with me. Here's to season 3 and on.